It was a cold morning in the small courthouse of Georgia, the kind of morning where the air felt sharp, but not yet cold enough to make anyone hurry. The judge hadn't arrived yet, so the room was filled with the quiet chatter of people waiting for their cases to be called. Some sat nervously, others looked through their phones, trying to pass the time. Alana Jeffries stood at the defense table, her hands folded in front of her, waiting. Her heart was racing, though she tried to stay calm. It wasn't the first time she'd been in a courtroom, but today felt different. Today, she was the one standing up for herself. She had been accused of shoplifting, a small mistake she'd made during a tough time in her life. She had been struggling to make ends meet, and in a moment of weakness, she took something from a store. She hadn't meant to get caught, but she did. And now, here she was, facing a fine and a possible criminal record. It wasn't the worst thing that could happen, but it felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Just as she was beginning to adjust to the quiet of the room, the door to the courtroom opened with a loud creak. The bailiff stepped in, calling out for everyone to rise. Judge Carson walked in, a middle-aged man with an air of authority, and everyone sat down. Alana noticed him glance in her direction, but his eyes quickly moved away. It didn't matter much. This was just another routine day for him. The case against Alana was called, and she stood up. A sheriff's deputy led her to the front of the room, where she was sworn in. Her palms were sweating, but she kept her chin high. She wasn't proud of what had happened, but she wasn't going to let them treat her like she was some criminal. She had a right to be treated fairly. But then, Officer Keller stood up. He was the officer who had arrested her, a tall, broad man with a hard look in his eyes. Keller seemed like the kind of person who thought the law was always right, no matter what. Alana had seen him before, back at the store when he had caught her. She remembered how he had looked at her then, like she was just another person to punish. But what happened next would stay with her forever. As Keller stepped forward, he gave a quick glance at Alana, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "I ask that the defendant remove her headscarf. It could be hiding something." Alana's heart skipped a beat. She didn't understand. It was just a scarf. But the judge nodded, barely glancing at her, as if it was an ordinary request. Before Alana could protest, Officer Keller stepped forward and grabbed the scarf from her head, pulling it off in one swift motion. Gasps filled the courtroom. Alana's hair, once hidden under the scarf, was now fully exposed. It wasn't the hair she had been born with. After chemotherapy, it had started to grow back in soft, uneven curls. Her scalp was still healing, and it wasn't something she wanted to show, especially not to strangers. But there it was, the moment of humiliation. People in the room snickered quietly, but Alana stood still, forcing herself to breathe. Her face remained calm, though inside, a storm was brewing. She wanted to shout, to run out of that room. But she didn't. She wouldn't let them see her break. She wasn't going to let them see her hurt. The laughter died down quickly, but the damage had been done. Alana wasn't just a defendant anymore. She was a target. The courtroom fell silent after Alana's headscarf was yanked off. All eyes were on her, some curious, some judgmental. Alana stood there, her hair exposed for everyone to see, feeling like she had been stripped of her privacy in the cruelest way possible. She wasn't just embarrassed. She felt humiliated. Her scalp, which had once been bald from chemotherapy, was still recovering. Her hair was slowly growing back, but it was uneven and thin in places. It was something she had been working hard to accept, but now, in front of so many strangers, it felt like the most fragile part of herself had been put on display. She could feel the heat rising to her face, but she fought the urge to react. She wanted to grab the scarf back, to wrap herself up again and hide from the world. But she didn't. Instead, she stood as still as she could, her eyes focused on the floor. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she didn't move. She knew she had to keep it together, no matter how much it hurt. Officer Keller stood at the side of the room, his expression blank. He seemed pleased with himself, like he had done something right. But Alana knew he didn't understand what he had just done. He hadn't just removed a scarf. He had taken something from her. Her dignity, her sense of control. She wasn't just a woman in court anymore. She was a woman who had been humiliated in front of strangers, in front of the people who were supposed to respect her. The judge, who had been silent through it all, finally spoke. "We'll proceed," he said in his usual monotone voice. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask if Alana was okay. He simply moved on, as if nothing had happened. But Alana could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had always known that life wasn't fair, but this felt different. This wasn't just about the law or about being punished for a mistake. This was personal. This was about being treated with respect, or rather, being denied respect. She had tried to push her past behind her, to move forward from the difficult times in her life. But now, it felt like the past was chasing her, pulling her back into that moment of vulnerability and weakness. As the trial continued, Alana barely heard the words being said. She could see the courtroom, but it felt like she was floating outside of herself, watching everything unfold from a distance. The laughter, the whispers, it all blurred together. But inside, she was processing everything. This moment, this humiliation, it wasn't going to define her. Not forever. Later, when the session ended, Alana left the courthouse with her head held high. The words and laughter from that room would stay with her for a long time, but she wasn't going to let them crush her. She would find a way to heal. She would find a way to fight back. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could change how she moved forward. She could take this hurt and turn it into something stronger. She would find a way to make her voice heard. And one day, she promised herself, she would stand in that courtroom again, not as a defendant, but as someone who had the power to change things. The weeks after the courtroom incident felt like a blur to Alana. She went through the motions of life, but everything felt heavier than it used to. She still worked long hours at the diner, still attended the legal aid office, but her heart wasn't in it the way it used to be. Every day, she thought about the moment the scarf was pulled off, about the way she had been exposed and mocked. She couldn't escape the feeling that part of her had been stolen that day. But despite everything, Alana knew she couldn't stay stuck in that moment forever. She had to keep moving. Her therapist had told her that healing was not a straight path. Some days, she'd feel okay, and other days, the weight of it all would hit her again. But each time it did, she reminded herself that she had made it this far. She had survived things much worse than this. Over time, Alana started focusing more on her studies. She enrolled in night classes at a community college, determined to finish her degree. The road to becoming a lawyer seemed long and difficult, but she was determined. Every book she read, every paper she wrote, felt like a step away from that courtroom, away from Officer Keller's cruel actions. It was like she was rebuilding herself from the inside out, one piece at a time. She didn't talk much about what happened to anyone at school or work. Most of her friends and family knew about the shoplifting incident, but they didn't know the details of the humiliation in the courtroom. Alana wasn't ready to share that yet. Sometimes she wondered if she ever would be. She wasn't sure what good it would do. Instead, she kept her head down, buried herself in her books, and worked hard. She had always been independent, and now she was more focused than ever before. But it wasn't all work. Alana made time for herself, too. She started taking walks around the park on weekends, something she hadn't done in a long time. The fresh air always cleared her head. It wasn't a solution to her problems, but it gave her a little peace. Some days, she felt like she was reclaiming the little joys in life that she had lost, like the feeling of sun on her face or the sound of birds in the trees. One evening, after finishing an assignment, Alana sat at her kitchen table and stared at the stack of books in front of her. She thought back to the courtroom, to the way she had felt so small and helpless. But she had made it this far. She wasn't small anymore. She had grown stronger. Each day, she was becoming someone else, a version of herself that was more resilient, more determined. Her dream of becoming a lawyer hadn't changed. In fact, it had grown more urgent. Alana knew that if she could survive what had happened in that courtroom, she could face anything. No one would ever take her dignity from her again. No one would ever make her feel small again. She was on a path to something better, and no one could stop her now. 5 years had passed since Alana stood in that courtroom, humiliated and exposed. A lot had changed. Alana had graduated from law school, passed the bar exam, and found a job working at a small legal firm. But there was one thing that had always been in the back of her mind: becoming a judge. She wanted to help people, to be the one who decided what was fair and just, and to make sure no one else felt as powerless as she had felt that day. She had worked hard, studied long hours, and built a reputation for herself. Now she was ready for the next step. Her dream came true when she was appointed as a judge in the same courthouse where everything had begun. The news spread quickly, and whispers filled the air. Some people were excited to see someone young, someone from a different background, in a position of power. But others were skeptical, especially when they found out who she was. Alana had been a defendant in that very courthouse all those years ago, and now she was the one who would be sitting behind the bench, making decisions that could change lives. One morning, as Alana prepared for her first official day on the bench, she tried not to let the weight of the situation get to her. She knew the eyes of the courthouse were on her, watching to see how she would handle her new role. But what they didn't know was that Alana wasn't nervous about the power she now held. What made her anxious was the possibility that she might run into someone she didn't want to see, someone who had been a part of her past. Officer Keller. Alana had tried to put the past behind her, but she knew that Officer Keller still worked as a police officer in the same town. He might be called into her courtroom at any time, and she wasn't sure how she would feel when that moment came. Would she be able to remain calm, to stay professional, or would the anger from all those years ago resurface? The morning passed slowly as Alana met with the staff, reviewed case files, and familiarized herself with the layout of the courtroom. Everything felt surreal, but it was also exciting. She was in control now. This was her chance to prove that she was capable, that she belonged here. She couldn't let the past dictate her future. Just before the lunch break, the doors of the courtroom opened, and in walked Officer Keller. Alana's heart skipped a beat. He didn't notice her at first. He was too focused on the case he had been called to testify for. But Alana knew the moment he saw her. His eyes flicked toward the bench, and for just a moment he froze. His expression changed, and he seemed unsure of what to do. Alana didn't react. She stayed calm, her face neutral, her gaze steady. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Officer Keller, the man who had humiliated her, was standing in her courtroom, asking her for justice. But now, Alana was the one who held the power. The room fell quiet as Officer Keller entered the courtroom. Alana sat behind the bench, pretending to focus on the case file in front of her, but her mind was far away. She had imagined this moment for so long, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her wanted to stand up and confront him, to remind him of what he had done to her all those years ago. But she couldn't do that. She was a judge now, and she had to remain calm and professional. As Keller walked into the room, he didn't seem to notice her right away. He was busy adjusting his uniform and getting ready to testify. It was only when he looked up and saw Alana sitting at the bench that his entire body seemed to freeze. His expression shifted, his jaw tightened, and his eyes widened just slightly. For a moment, it was as if time stood still. Alana didn't let herself react. She kept her gaze steady, her face neutral, and her hands resting on the sides of the bench. She had learned long ago how to control her emotions, to hide her feelings behind a mask of calmness. But inside, her heart was racing. She couldn't deny the small feeling of victory that surged through her. Here he was, standing before her, and he was the one who seemed out of place now. For a brief second, Alana saw something in his eyes that surprised her. Fear, or maybe uncertainty. It was almost as if he didn't know what to do next. Officer Keller had always been so confident, so sure of himself when he was in control. But now, standing in front of the woman he had once humiliated, That confidence seemed to slip away. He cleared his throat and quickly looked down at his notes, trying to regain his composure, but Alana could tell that he was rattled. The calm, controlled demeanor he had shown in the past was gone. Now he was just a man caught off guard by the very person he had underestimated. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, but a little less certain than before, "I'm here to testify on behalf of the prosecution." His words were familiar, but the tone had changed. It was no longer the same officer who had made her feel small in front of a room full of strangers. Now he was speaking to someone who had the power to shape his future. Alana didn't need to say anything to remind him of that. Her presence was enough. As the trial continued, Officer Keller stumbled through his testimony. His answers were brief, and his confidence seemed to fade with each question. Alana didn't interrupt. She let him talk, let him trip over his words, all while maintaining her calm composure. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to make him feel the humiliation he had put her through. The simple act of sitting behind the bench, of holding the power that he had once wielded, was more than enough. By the time he finished his testimony, Officer Keller couldn't get out of the courtroom fast enough. He barely glanced at Alana as he left, his shoulders slumped, his posture defeated. It was as though the weight of the past had finally caught up with him. Alana watched him go, but she didn't feel anger. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt something else. Peace. This was her moment, and she had handled it with grace. No words needed to be exchanged. The balance had shifted, and she was finally where she belonged. The days following Officer Keller's testimony felt different for Alana. The courthouse was a place she had always associated with pain, humiliation, and her past mistakes. But now, it felt different. It wasn't just a place where decisions were made. It was her place. Alana had earned her seat at that bench, and she had proven to herself that she was stronger than the experiences that once tried to break her. The ripple effect of that day's events stayed with her. The other people in the courthouse started to treat her with more respect, as if they recognized the strength it took to rise above her past. Some colleagues even approached her with kind words, offering congratulations for handling the situation with such calmness. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know the depth of what she had been through, but they saw something in her now, something that made her more than just a judge. They saw someone who had fought for her place in the world. For the first time in a long time, Alana felt like she could breathe easier. She wasn't weighed down by the past, even if it still lingered in the background. She had taken that moment, that opportunity, and made it hers. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was someone who had fought and won. But there was still work to be done. Alana's mission was clear. She wanted to make sure that no one else felt as powerless as she once had. She knew that her position gave her the chance to change things, to advocate for fairness and justice in a way that was personal to her. Her heart was still passionate about the people who came before her in court, about the ones who needed a voice to stand up for them. One afternoon, as Alana reviewed a case involving a young woman accused of theft, she felt a connection to the girl's situation. The woman's story was similar to Alana's own from years ago. Struggling, desperate, and making choices she would later regret. But the woman hadn't been given the opportunity that Alana had. She hadn't been able to move past her mistake in the way Alana had been able to. Alana paused, her pen hovering over the case file. She thought about what it felt like to be judged harshly, to be treated like a criminal rather than a person who had made a mistake. She couldn't change the past, but she could make a difference in the present. She would make sure that this young woman got a fair chance, a chance to learn, to grow, and to prove herself. It wasn't just about the law for Alana. It was about people. She understood now more than ever that everyone had a story, a reason for why they did what they did. It wasn't always simple or easy to understand, but that was what made justice complex. Alana wasn't just deciding cases, she was deciding futures. And she wasn't going to let anyone else feel the way she had felt all those years ago, not on her watch. The courtroom had once been a place of pain, but now it was a place of healing. Not just for others, but for herself. Alana knew she had come a long way, and no matter how many obstacles lay ahead, she was ready to face them. With each decision she made, she was building the future she had always dreamed of, a future where she could give others the chance she had fought so hard to claim for herself. It had been a few months since Alana had taken the bench, and each day she felt more confident in her role as a judge. The courtroom, once a place of pain for her, had now become a space of responsibility, where she made decisions that affected the lives of others. With each case she handled, Alana felt herself growing, becoming the kind of judge she had always hoped to be: fair, thoughtful, and determined to seek justice. But one day, a case came before her that would test her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The defendant was a man named Larry Thompson, a local shop owner accused of theft. The charges were serious, but it wasn't the crime itself that caught Alana's attention. It was the face in front of her. Larry Thompson looked familiar, almost too familiar. As he stood before her, nervously adjusting his tie, Alana couldn't place where she had seen him before, but she knew she had. When the court began, Alana listened to the details of the case. Larry had been accused of stealing from his own store, but there were strange inconsistencies in the evidence. His business was struggling, and the items he was accused of taking were things he could have easily sold for money. However, his story didn't add up, and Alana could sense that there was more to it than met the eye. She found herself thinking back to her own experience, the way things had seemed to spiral out of control when she was younger, and how sometimes people made mistakes because they didn't know where to turn. As Larry spoke, Alana couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen him somewhere before. Something about his face seemed too familiar, but it wasn't until she glanced over at his defense attorney that the memory clicked. The attorney was someone she knew from her past. A long time ago, when she had been struggling with her own situation, this man had been a part of the team that helped her with her case. He had offered her advice and even stood up for her when things had seemed impossible. It was a strange and unexpected connection. As the trial continued, Alana found herself questioning everything. The facts were unclear, and the testimony from the prosecution seemed too simple, too one-sided. She could feel the weight of her past on her shoulders as she remembered her own experiences in the courtroom. Had she been treated fairly? Had the system really been as just as it claimed to be? When the trial ended for the day, Alana sat alone in her office, staring at the case file in front of her. She knew that this wasn't just a case of theft. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Larry's case reminded her of her own journey. His mistakes weren't so different from the ones she had made. She understood that sometimes people needed more than just punishment. They needed a chance to rebuild, a chance to be heard. The next day, Alana called for a recess. She needed time to think, to weigh the options. This wasn't going to be an easy decision, but she knew that it was one she had to make carefully. Larry deserved more than just a verdict. He deserved a chance to tell his story, just as she had done all those years ago. Alana realized that her role as a judge wasn't just about following the law. It was about seeing the humanity in each case and making sure that every person was given the chance they needed to change. The courtroom was quieter than usual as Alana prepared to make her ruling. Larry Thompson sat nervously in the defendant's chair, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His defense attorney sat beside him, a serious expression on his face. Alana felt the weight of the moment. She had spent days thinking about this case, the strange feeling that had come over her when she first saw Larry, and the connection to her own past. She wasn't sure what was right or wrong anymore, but she knew that this decision would define her as a judge. She glanced at the case file one last time. The evidence was weak, and the prosecution's argument had been far from convincing. Larry had been accused of stealing goods from his store, but there were too many questions left unanswered. His story didn't make sense, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. People didn't steal from themselves without a reason. Something had pushed him to this point, just like something had pushed her all those years ago. As Alana sat there, her thoughts drifted back to the day she had stood in the same courthouse, just a young woman with little to no hope. She had made mistakes, yes, but those mistakes hadn't defined her. And she didn't want them to define anyone else either. Larry wasn't a criminal. He was a man who had made a mistake, maybe out of desperation, maybe out of fear. She had been given a second chance. Maybe it was time to give someone else that same opportunity. Alana cleared her throat, her voice steady as she addressed the courtroom. After careful consideration of the evidence, the testimony, and the circumstances surrounding this case, I have come to a decision, she said. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on her. Mr. Thompson, the court finds that there is insufficient evidence to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You are hereby acquitted of the charges against you. A wave of relief washed over Larry's face. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time during the trial, a small smile appeared on his face. The defense attorney nodded in approval, while the prosecution seemed frustrated, but no one interrupted. Alana's ruling was final. As the courtroom began to clear out, Alana remained seated behind the bench, staring at the empty space where Larry had just been. She wasn't sure if she had made the right decision, but she knew she had made the decision that felt true to her. Sometimes, the law didn't have all the answers, and sometimes the answers weren't as clear as people wanted them to be. But in her heart, Alana knew she had given Larry a chance to rebuild his life. When the last person left the courtroom, Alana stood up and took a deep breath. She looked out at the empty seats before her, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. This was her job. This was why she had become a judge, not just to enforce the law, but to offer a chance for people to change. She had done it for herself, and now she had done it for someone else. As Alana walked out of the courtroom, she knew the road ahead would never be easy, but she also knew that she was ready for whatever came next. With each decision she made, she was becoming the kind of judge she had always dreamed of, one who saw the people, not just the cases, and that, she realized, was what really mattered.